have a very packed morning this morning. We have two presentations. The first one is in regards to NFPA 25 versus the Ontario Fire Code. Steele is our presenter. Bit of a timely topic to bring up, just because there are some proposed coded changes, and the Ontario Fire Code, maybe in the future, very short future, we might see just NFPA 25 referenced. So with that, I will turn it over to Steve, and he can introduce himself and also kick it off for us.
If we can just jump in quickly, Gary, sorry to interrupt Gary and Steve. If there are any questions from the attendees, please just put them in the question and answer. We'll leave it up to Steve if he wants to answer them. I'll let him know that there are some, and we do have the chat. So please feel free to use that, as I'll be monitoring the question answers and the chat in the group. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Gary. Yeah, if I guess in the meantime, Vince, or if you can enable the share, allow me to share as well in the meantime, but I'll give you a brief introduction of myself. My name is Steve Steele. I am a red seal sprinkler fitter, or have been for quite a few years. Also have some experience with design and project management on the engineering side with fire protection companies for fire protection systems. And also a brief instructor experience around 2008 with the delivery of the apprenticeship training through the province of Ontario. That led into a coordinating position with that delivery agent. And then ultimately, since the end of 2009, happily working from home. Unfortunately, not a lot of travel, but I have taken on a position of the National Training Director for the National Sprinkler Industry, JTAC. Just briefly, what that agency is, or what that committee is a board of representation of the industry, both contractors, labor, and so forth. We promote and support training throughout the country, through all the provinces, and also work with south of the border because, as we know, with NFPA 25, it is an international standard. And I'll kind of explain with that. So there's not a lot of differences with 25 when we do cross the border internationally in that regards. I've also been involved with RSOS development for apprenticeship, IP exams, the province of Ontario curriculum development and delivery, as well as development of an ITM certification through NOSC in our country here, and then also a member ASSE for inspection, testing, and maintenance of fire protection systems through that international agency as well. But let me try and get the share screen going here.
Yeah, you should be able to do that, Steve, now.
Excellent. Let's see if hopefully I got that right, and everybody, you can see the PowerPoint or the start of the PowerPoint.
Not yet, Steve. Gary will just double check his back end there as well.
Okay, let me try that again and share. There we go. Should see a title screen.
We're good to go.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Awesome. Okay, I try. Well, we're gonna hit. There's a lot of topics, a lot of information to cover, especially when you consider NFPA 25. I'm not going to pretend I know my audience here. I won't profess to be an expert on the Ontario Fire Code. Albeit we are familiar with what it does cover when it comes to fire protection systems, especially that of 6.4, 6.5, 6.6, and 6.8. Those systems and kind of the limitations that are involved with the inspection, testing, and maintenance, and kind of the caveat or the ability to utilize 25 on a limited application to those references that are in the Ontario Fire Code. So yeah, to get through all the information in 25, it is a daunting task. Some of the training sessions that we provided to, especially those conducting this work, you're 40 plus hours. So it is a lot of information, a lot of stuff to cover. But I'll kind of go through the historic value of 25. Some of you could be very much aware of that document through previous experience and so forth. But we'll touch on some of those areas, some of the things that may change or how that will affect. For the most part, Most of the industry will agree that 25 is definitely maybe the better document in comparison to, but it's still, as industry expect, that is the minimum document that we do have, and how that will affect the Ontario Fire Code. There are a few nuances that still have to be reviewed, and adoption of this sole document may affect what's in the Ontario Fire Code and how you enforce it today. Let's get one of the slides here. So briefly, as far as what we're looking at, what I'll speak on today and kind of highlight in the date and the time that we are now, the two editions that we're kind of looking at: the Ontario Fire Code 2015. I believe it was last amended in 2019, according to record there. And 25, although the current edition is 2020, what is available now, that was issued in 2019. And Ontario Fire Code does reference the 2014 edition. The standard, or the National Fire Code, we're looking at 2017. So hypothetically speaking, as Gary said, as changes do come up here, if there was adoption, you're probably looking at the 2017 edition. And I think we're pretty much used to looking at a couple editions behind from what's current, but that's what we'll kind of reference, and that's what I've done in preparation for this presentation today, is looking at those two versions or those editions of what we have. So what is NFPA 25? Like I mentioned, is the international or what industry considers the minimum practice for inspection and testing and maintenance for water-based systems. References to installation. This has come up in the past where we're not having the ability to use NFPA 25. You can kind of thread that needle when you look at installation standards on the newer installations like NFPA 13, 14, 20, and 24, that they do reference NFPA 25 in there. And it's almost conditional to a new installation, is that it shall be enforced to maintain those systems to 25, albeit the regulatory requirements are prescribed in the province. That gives the awareness. And then even in the province of Ontario, I know through talking with associations like Joanne Gauthier over at CASA, they strongly recommend, or most of their members or contractors do use NFPA 25 as their standard, even though it's not typically enforced on Ontario. As we kind of move across the country, a lot of those agencies, contractors, property managers, they are national entities, so they kind of set that bar and self-regulate in that regards as well. The National Fire Code, as I mentioned, 2017 is referenced in the National Fire Code as it states right now for the minimum for water-based systems. Provinces in Canada, again, just to give you an awareness kind of what goes on, there are some differences. It's getting pretty close to, we'll say that word harmonized, albeit whether that's documents or practice. So apart from the province of Ontario and the province of PEI, everybody has by facto accepted or adopted NFPA 25 as the standard for ITM, and that's through the application or the adoption of the National Fire Code. So obviously Ontario still has the OFC, which is in place and accepts 25 for those specific items only. And just for your information, as far as PEI, they're the only province that still, for some reason, they don't have a provincial fire code. They reference NFPA 1, which is its own fire code. Although with PEI, from experience, they kind of they fall in line with the province of New Brunswick for the most part, especially on the apprenticeship end and enforcement of some of the standards or work therein. So additions of 25. So as NFC will adopt or change on their typical cycle, everybody kind of follows with that. If a province such as, we'll say, Alberta recognizes the National Fire Code, whatever is referenced in that fire code on their cycles, that becomes kind of the benchmark for the addition or what is current to be enforced. The exception with that is the province of Newfoundland, and they actually have regulatory requirements. They will, and they do adapt all new available standards. So if NFPA comes out with a new standard, be it NFPA 13, NFPA 25, it is automatically adopted 6 months after the issuance of that. So typical code cycles in an NFPA, if it comes up September of 1 year, you're going to be looking at 6 months so into the new year. That automatically becomes adopted into effect. So we can look at for NFPA 25, they're already on, I believe it would be this month, they're already on the 2020 edition of NFPA 25 as well. Province of Quebec, it's always a little bit different, we'll say, when it comes to regulatory standards and enforcement. I believe even the province doesn't adopt National Fire Code, but it does, based on municipalities or certain cities, will formally recognize and utilize the National Fire Code as well. When it comes to NFPA, unfortunately, they are at the mercy of the language issues, and that's once that code is available in French, then they can adopt it. Especially with NFPA 13 and NFPA 25, they go through. NFPA only allows, or because of copyright issues, they allow one body to translate, and that's through the CMPP, which is actually based in France. So it's more Parisian French, and that's a whole other topic. The language and the translations do get a bit clumsy, but that's what kind of regulates the editions that they work on in the province of Quebec. So cycles, I mentioned about cycles itself. Obviously, National Fire Code runs on a 5-year cycle. We do have our hopes and promises that is going to be released, or it's due to release. The last I heard was the first quarter of this year, which we're coming next to the end of it. So we'll see how that progresses and what references for additions are in there as well. The NFPA, or most of those standards, run on a 3-year cycle for adoption. So, and again, I'll get into closer to the end kind of, how that cycle kind of works and the input and changes, because this becomes important for the province of Ontario. By recognition of another standard or an international standard is the influence or the ability to have changes in those codes or to make recommendations. So this opens up a whole new avenue or a method of, if something can be changed for the betterment, you have the option of within the standard or within your own regulatory requirements. Sometimes it's for the betterment of industry. Sometimes you might want to go the path of the standard because it helps not only the province, but the industry at large as well. A little bit of history of NFPA 25 for those, some may know, some may not. So it was historically, look at even NFPA 13 going way back, it was typically a pamphlet, quite a small document when you look at it in comparison to where we are now. But NFPA 13A came after the fact of having installation. It was a recommended practice. So it was kind of a guideline or a suggestion adopted in 1940. And that went on as kind of a recommended practice up until 1987. So it wasn't enforceable. It wasn't mandatory. There was no language in there that you shall do this stuff. It was more of a guidance for owners and property managers that this is what you should be doing. It's kind of the maintenance manual with the car when you buy it, if you will. It wasn't really regulatory or the ability to enforce it. So no mandatory language. The sprinkler industry through itself, and just to give a history, what I've been aware of, or kind of the beginning of my career, it was ITM was just starting out or in its infancy. So through the 60s, 70s, and 80s, we can say fundamentally in Canada, between Montreal, Toronto, and even out west in the early 80s, installation was a primary focus for fire protection systems. So a lot of that, even with codes and standards, went to new installations. As you get into the later 80s into the 90s itself, you have a lot of buildings with these systems in it. So with that came opportunities in the ITM field, so to speak, where you have, and where we look at currently now, you can have companies based solely on ITM of fire protection systems, not so much background in installation, but fundamentally is the upkeep or the maintenance of it. So almost industry-wise, it's kind of bulletproof to recession, but more importantly, there is a need to keep these systems up to date and current, because, and just throwing the number out as far as, what's the longevity of a fire protection system, and historically, you're looking at anything from pipe to fittings to equipment, although some systems have been in longer, you're looking at around the 50-year mark, 50 to 60 years. You're looking at some major replacements or modifications, and especially with the pipe, you look at in the early 90s, the pipe got thinner and smaller because of the economy, because of the cost of doing this. It was available to have a smaller pipe to make it cost effective, not only for those that are selling it, but for those buying it as well. It's like any of our regulatory changes, you can adopt a regulation, but if it's not palatable or affordable to the consumer, it's really not going to happen. So that smaller pipe, we're starting to see that now in the early 90s. It does not have the longevity of that 50-year, especially if it doesn't have a proper ITM maintenance program going in there beyond that of what's being enforced. So prior to the creation of 25, what they did find out, and probably some of you may be aware of, what leads to system failure on fire protection, especially water-based sprinkler systems. What is the number one cause of? And it's very well documented, and you can find out that most of those failures, not only for improperly maintained systems, but routine things such as not following up as far as when a system has been serviced is what justifies or verifies that valve has now been returned to the open position or fully open. So a lot of those causes is obstructions in the pipe, because it wasn't cared for or maintained or inspected. And then also at the same time, if that valve was not open or inadvertently left closed or not fully open, change in water availability and so forth, that was the major cause from what they found. So 65% of those documented failures came to improperly maintained systems, something that could have been very easily picked up on a routine inspection or the annual test of that system by comparing results to previous years. So the Nfpa Technical Committee at that time, they realized that this was important now to have mandatory language to ensure that these, again, we're dealing with passive systems here. It's not no derogatory intent to the other systems that are out there, but if you can't flush the toilet, somebody's going to get a phone call. These systems are expected to work, but at the most part, they lay dormant for far too long before they're expected to do what they're supposed to do. So that Nfpa Technical Committee in 1990 was appointed, and Nfpa 25 was created at that point. So in 1992, we did actually officially get, and again, this is not going back too long ago. Nfpa 25 was adopted in 1992, and so those are the cycles or the revisions that we stand to at now, being at 2020 being the most current. These dates are kind of important because if one may consider, we're looking at we will be looking at some of the differences between Nfpa 25 and the Ontario Fire Code. These dates are important because if you look historically, and not off the tip of my tongue, but you're looking at adoption of or having Ontario Fire Code, early 80s, somewhere around that time that this was developed. This is pre-Nfpa 25 we're talking about. So the Ontario Fire Code was actually ahead of its time in that regards, that they mandated language. They wanted a bare minimum standard where it didn't exist. Now we come to 2022, one has superseded the other. So one may ask, well, why does Ontario not adopt or utilize this document? And I think it's that transition period, again, whether it be the politics or the influence therein is, it was ahead of time at one point. And now what the bare minimum is, the OFC has kind of fallen below what industry considers to be the bare minimum. So that's pretty much it for the history lesson. Now, the advantage of Nfpa 25, it does create a larger document, more in depth, more entailed. I've heard everything from the fear of, to go to this, you're going to get a lot of pushback on the economics. Again, I think for the most part, I know who I'm speaking to, you understand what the importance is or the criteria to ensure that something is going to operate. You want to make sure it's tested, it's maintained, at least somebody is looking at this at some point or another. So the main difference between 25 and the OFC, again, the OFC from the inception or the age of when it was, NFPA 25 is more of a, based on performance, is more of an analytical, if you will, comparative. It's not a verification, it's not a validation or a checklist. Even when you get into the report, so the reporting of an inspection and test on an annual for some of these systems, it shouldn't be necessarily a checkbox if something was looked at, something was operated. You're going to see that when you look at some of these inspection reports. It's a matter of how things were conducted and what were done and what were those results. It's kind of like looking at or doing a check on your car before, sitting in your driveway. You check the fuel, you check the air pressure in your tire. You haven't even taken the car on the road, but you're deeming it to be operable and safe to do so. So this NFPA 25, it kind of allows you to take that car on the road, if you will. So it gives you the criteria for actually testing. What are the minimum frequencies you're going to test these systems at, and what are you actually looking for? It's just not a checklist of things are there or things appear to be operable. It's actually putting it through the paces, and especially with that, at what level are you doing the test to? It's just not a slight level. You're doing that system required. You're doing full flow tests. You're doing and again, some may fear, well, you don't want something to go wrong. Well, this is where you want it to go wrong. On the ITM, you don't want it to go wrong during a fire scenario when it's needed for the protection of the property, the life, or the fire services that are there suppressing the fire. So with that comes performance data comparison. So very integral part of NFPA 25. You get those results, you collect the data, but you also do a comparison of the data to previous years and the original acceptance testing or commissioning of that system. You're going to see some deviations to that. You're going to see it degrade over time. That is a natural cause. Pipe's going to get a little bit corroded inside. It's going to get, areas will build up. Your water supply would be affected. So it's keeping your finger on the pulse to, at some point, when that slides below the benchmark, something has to be done to improve that. So that's, that falls on the owner, the onus of the owner, the municipalities in some cases. I know that's a whole other kettle of fish that you can open up, is who's providing what. And quite frankly, it comes down to the success of that, or the expectation of that system, and the ability to perform as needed. If you start robbing it of the water supply, then you get into some very serious trouble. So again, as I mentioned, exposure problems and issues, that becomes very important. That's when you want it to happen. That's when you want it to be remedied. So regular routine care and maintenance and operation, again, it's part of the lifespan. So if it's not exercise, if you're trying to, keep this in the closet and make it last longer, you're fighting a battle that you're going to risk it not operating or doing what it's supposed to as well. Another key point is the criteria for deficiencies and impairments. This, we can spend a whole day reviewing what is a critical and non-critical deficiencies versus an impairment itself. What becomes important is you want to avoid impairments, or more importantly, you want to identify impairments, and that can go so far as not only to the owner, those conducting it, but to the local authority having jurisdiction. Is when something is impaired, that system has been deemed inoperable and out of service for the most part. That could be as simple as a fire pump out of service. Even though water can be delivered, can it be delivered to the performance requirements of that system itself? Critical and non-critical deficiencies, that is very much subjective to the most part. So you're relying on those trained and qualified doing it to identify. That's your checklist of preventative maintenance that does have to be done or put on there. So there are some non-critical, improvements or replacements that are needed. Comparable to that is like changing the filter in your furnace. Critical deficiency, that's on the border, and any kind of avoidance of remedy on critical, that's going to lead you to impairment at some point or another, or affect the operation or performance of that system itself. And the last column I have on there is that system status identification. So the more you do work these systems as far as routine maintenance or testing, that valve status, that is absent in the Ontario Fire Code as it is now, regardless of what you asked or require to be performed on that system. The valve status test is one of the most important things on there, and that comes with the training and the competency of those doing the work. Anybody can turn a valve. You can show somebody, okay, you close the valve, you open that valve, you've verified that it has worked. But with that comes a burden of responsibility. From the time it takes to close the valve and open the valve, how can you guarantee that that is actually in the status that it was before, or even exposing a problem that the valve is either, you look at a butterfly valve where it is indicating that something happens where that valve doesn't open fully. There's something lodged in there that's now going to affect the performance. So there is some requirements in 25 that says once you do touch a system, there's checks that you have to do to ensure that the system is operable. It forces you now to do a performance analysis, how little it is. It might be that 2-inch main drain test. It might be additional servicing as far as lubricating the stem on an OS and Y. There are expectations. It's kind of, again, go back to the car analogy. When they take your tires off, you're hoping for that qualified person to have a look around, not just do the bare minimum, but to expose and identify any of that potential or recommendation that goes along, and to verify that that's going to work or perform as needed as well. So let's get into a little bit of the meat of what we're talking about here. So again, I just kind of broke it down in comparison. We have Division B, Part 6, 6.4. It basically deals with your standpipe and hose systems. So I'll first touch on what's required, or what, this is a small little piece of what NFPA 25 does. If you look at Chapter 6 and NFPA 25, it gives you the bare minimum requirements, and you'll see obviously that minimum or expectation is a little bit more than what's in OFC. However, it includes a lot of the components and equipment that are on those systems that have to be checked and verified as well. Most importantly, especially when you look at standpipe systems and what the need and the call and the use of these for firefighting provisions, beyond everything, and I know we're going through as far as hoses, what's going to be there, testing of hoses, are they actually being used? Irrelevant to that, the most important part of that is the valve and the exercise and use of that valve. And there are cases, especially in high pressure, when a valve's been closed and sitting closed for 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, the likelihood and the chances of that opening and operating, there have been cases of that failure, and if you're not exercising or doing a proper full function test of these systems, you have no way of ensuring or knowing that these things are going to work. So we have flow testing as well. I know there's some instances of flow testing. We'll get to those criteria in the OFC, but so full flow testing, design criteria, performance. So every 5 years, you're going to be testing or verifying the water availability for that full standpipe test. And then also the hydrostatic testing, and this one particular we'll get into in the next slide, of dry system, anything that has dry system piping, so semi-automatic, full dry system. You get into some of the construction, some of the projects that are longer than 5 years, your temporary standpipe, all that stuff has to be hydrostatically tested as per 25 every 5 years. That includes the FTC pipe. So I know with the OREGs that change, and I know the advocating of the fire service to get that in there, that's a big problem in Ontario, and this would encompass or allow that for the 5 years as well. Main drain tests, what I've mentioned, so you're ensuring control valves, status testing, what condition that system is going to be in. So at bare minimum, an annual function is to say that somebody has checked off, somebody qualified and competent has checked off that system will run and perform as needed on an annual basis as well. So what is not in NFPA 25? So again, just briefly going through some of this, we worked on consultation with City of Toronto, myself and Joanne from CASA, with the Ontario Fire Chiefs prior to their submission. I know it wasn't a lot of homework needed to be done on that, but kind of how does that affect? If we're asked for this change, what do you stand to lose? The only thing I did find in there, and just to bring it to light as well, systems restored after a period of disuse. So when something is taken down or out of service, being a standpipe, is what's required to recommission that. So this is more of a language thing. I'm not saying it doesn't get identified. Again, if it's misused or what you deem as being a period of deuse, has it been decommissioned? Has it been officially taken out of service, or has it just been shut down? So again, depending on the parameters or the enforcement, if you take something out of service, what are the requirements to take that out of service? There are existing or means to any fire protection system. If you take it out of service, it must be identified to the AHJ. So it would almost fall into that of commissioning or recommissioning that system when you put it back into service. So not only standpipe, but sprinkler systems themselves usually entail a lot of that paperwork, or at least identification from owner to AHJ. So that may have take some review as well by the powers that be to make sure that is not just disregarded, that there's some language, or at least assured that it's covered when you have a disuse of a standpipe system. Another one appears in a couple of spots, and it comes up again with fire pumps. Specifically in the OFC, it identifies buildings containing a hotel require flow testing to be done annually. So again, if you go back to NFPA 25, there is no pertinence to that of a hotel or requesting a more regular flow testing of those systems as well. The last one I put in there, and this is familiar, looking through OREG 818, the one as far as for testing of FTCs, when that came in, I think it's good to highlight an importance, and hopefully somebody is looking at this, is when you adopt or say solely the provider of ITM in Ontario will be NFPA 25, is how you're going to enforce that and some of the dates to do that. Going through some of that language, it was very clear that, the implementation date is X, and if you haven't done it since a period of time, you don't want a gap to happen to say, tomorrow we're starting to use 25. Does that mean that nobody's done some of these flow testing? Does that give them another 5 years, or is it enforceable on a particular date? A lot of these questions will come up, especially for yourselves doing the enforcement, is what is the enforcement date? What is the circumstances to the last time a test was done, and when can we apply the requirement of its due? So it becomes important factors. You may be putting an inadvertent gap, although you're looking for improvement at 25, you may put a considerable amount of gap of time if it's not addressed, or at least recognized at some point. Move into as far as sprinkler systems. So again, giving the bare minimum requirements, and then it hits a lot, especially sprinkler systems. They're getting more complex, a lot of bells and whistles on there. Actually going through some of this, some small things, relief valves become very important. And believe it or not, NFPA 25 does not recognize relief valves, whether that's a gap. I know that information has been passed on, or they're looking at it, but to ensure these relief valves work, it not necessarily affects the performance, but it does affect the possibly the integrity of these systems as well. Internal piping condition and obstruction investigations, that's an important one. So that gets somebody to look at or to document what's going on with these systems year to year over longevity. Again, getting to 50 to 60 years, you have to question. And unfortunately with ITM, the more you exercise the system, you can be detrimental by, what I mean by that is if you have a water-based system and you introduced air into the system by just the function of flow testing and main drain tests, you have to be very diligent in getting that air out. Again, a qualified person venting that air, because you may affect the longevity of the pipe and have issues with it. But within the document, you are checking that as an ongoing basis. So even though they are being exercised, if they are prone, especially the lighter wall pipe, that Schedule 5 pipe that was put in through the 90s, you get to have that assessment, or at least you're keeping your finger on the pulse for that. So, and with impairments too, it clearly identifies what is done, or when you do have an impairment. So whether it's pre-planned during ITM process or an emergency where something is deemed not operable, there are steps of what has to be done, whether it's impairment coordinators, notification to the AHJ. You have a lot of information and processes you can lean on to what has to be done and how to manage that as well. So what is not in as far as for sprinkler systems, the one in there that I did identify, the closing of the sprinkler. So this is in a fire scenario. So it clearly identifies in OFC that you're not to close the valve if, it may affect if somebody closes too early, obviously for our obvious reasons. It's not specified in 25, but in 25 it does identify that an owner or anybody other than the fire department shall not, you cannot close or you cannot impair a system, even though it seems obvious, but in a fire scenario, it's no different than if it was on a Monday and there's no fire. You cannot touch it without notifying the fire department as well. So there is some necessary, you're going to lose it, not the specific language, but it's something to look at it as well for that process. Underground alterations refer to Nfpa 24. So the only thing that changed in there are some references to the flushing requirement, and I believe the old method of looking at, you can only lose so many quarts per joints on underground installation. That has changed, so it's not something that's going to be lost. It's something that will be updated. So there is new ways to determine leak, permissible leak on underground, because believe it or not, it's allowed to leak to a certain degree, but it still has to require pressure test and flow testing. So you will get an update, not necessarily lose anything of particular value. Now you get into water supplies. This is a lot of good information, and especially with the adoption of Nfpa 25, covers a lot, especially your fire pumps. So not a lot of language as far as fire pumps, or especially with the changes in the updates to fire pumps when it comes to frequencies. You're probably aware of, or you've heard it does flip-flop, or the tendency to flip-flop on durations, even your weeklies versus your monthlies. So you're supposed to do an annual full flow assessment on a fire pump, but then you have your weeklies and monthlies that the owner is supposed to operate or start and run those fire pumps under churn. So at one point it was desired or required to be done weekly. They pulled out electric fire pumps, said, you know what, they're pretty reliable, comparable to a diesel. You don't have to get them up to operating temperature. They changed the duration of the run and even the frequency to monthly. And then now they step back, even in 25, you have to be very cautious. Is there enough water to run without fire department influence or addition to it, versus do you have to run it weekly versus monthly? So some things you do have to check to stay on top of with Nfpa 25. Flow test requirements: underground pipe, hydrants, fire pumps, backflow preventers. A couple of things to note, two things that will come up, especially the province of Ontario. Backflow preventers being one, because of municipal regulations or requirements for inspection, testing, and maintenance. You have two requirements now. Once you get Nfpa 25 as a standard or enforceable under the fire code or in the province, you now have two regulatory bodies looking at requirements. So a backflow test, an annual test done by or as required by municipality, done through OMFPOA and so forth, does not meet all the requirements of Nfpa 25 or the fire system. So you ensure that it works and protects the municipal system, but what you haven't done is you haven't done your full forward flow test on it, that it will still provide, or with that device on there, will the fire protection system still function? So there's additional tests. So you may have a duplication of testing here and qualifications to do those tests. That's also true with TSSA and the fuel systems for a diesel fire pump. Again, topics probably for another day, but that will be coming as well. Is you have TSSA requirements, but now you have Nfpa 20 requirements that a lot more encompassing than what I'm talking about, backflow preventers, that may in some cases contravene what TSSA is looking for and the qualifications to do so. So you may be looking at additional or coordination with some of those regulatory authorities as well. Internal pipe condition and obstruction investigation, similar to the above ground systems, and with the impairments as well. Written reports requirements, a lot more documentation, not just a certificate that we were used to for the past 20, 25 years of saying that it passed or somebody looked at it. You have that quantifiable and those results and that data at your fingertips as well. Preventive maintenance programs for fire pumps, so minimum things to do to ensure, not just waiting for the next annual test. And we'll get into as far as OFC. Antifreeze requirements, that came into as far as water supplies, whether it's dealing specifically with hydrants or how or why it was introduced into the OFC. Obviously with NFPA, that has changed systematically. albeit I know some people were shocked to learn that antifreeze was flammable, and is really no surprise. Everybody kind of knew that antifreeze was flammable. It's just the application, the use, where it really went south in water and fire protection systems is when you saw antifreeze starting to show up in residential occupancies. It wasn't so much, if you had an outdoor based system with antifreeze because you couldn't heat that long conveyor or something to that effect. That flash of combustible or the risk, it's kind of like a dry system, is you're introducing air first. But when you're doing that in a residential occupancy, it was a recipe for disaster in that regard. So that ongoing, by adopting 25, you kind of fall into that current information as well. The other one I found, cathodic protection. So you're looking on for tanks, not necessarily affecting the performance of the system, but it is for the most part for the integrity of the longevity. They do still have interior and exterior inspection required. They do have frequency changes. If there is corrosion protection, such as cathodic, it does reduce the need to investigate or to maintain the condition of the tank itself. So that one, the word of cathodic is not necessarily, or you won't find it in 25. Pressure tanks, not as specific in 25, but they do still cover as far as various frequencies and levels and pressures of air and water. But the one that is missing, and like I mentioned before, this is missing on all systems in general, is the need for relief valves. So, where it started with gridded wet pipe systems requiring relief valves to now all wet pipe systems require relief valves, there is no language in 25. So it's a matter of, like I said, it has been identified, or there is discussions requiring from that committee to have specific language on relief valves as well. Again, with the hotels, fire pump operation frequencies, this was longer, so it's not necessarily you're probably going to get more stringent, is that they had leniency for the operation or the run tests for churn on a monthly basis for hotels, obviously, whether that's for disruption or otherwise. And then NFPA 25, important note, the ITM for hydrants is guidance applied for private hydrants only. This does not cover municipal hydrants in that regard. You may get in Ontario, I know by experience that you do get a lot in as far as drainage. You got some municipalities that they will not allow drainage on a dry barrel hydrant because that's an influence or a gate for contamination to get into the municipal system through reverse, we'll say, direction of groundwater getting into the municipal system through those drainage holes themselves. Some places you'll find them plugged. Through the years, I've heard of everything of people dumping antifreeze in there to prevent it, or more active, prior to freezing condition, they get out there and they do pump them out as well. So that's more of on a municipal level. But again, hydrants being that of private for NFPA 25, hydrant marking. So that's not necessarily fall into 25 because it's specific to private hydrants, where if you look at NFPA, I believe it's 291, that's for municipal hydrants, the marking of the caps and the head of the hydrant, where private hydrants is kind of a recommendation, if you will. So depending if your municipality is actually enforcing or requiring that to be done, that you won't find in 25 of that language for marking as well. So I just wanted to bring up, I don't know, Vince, I don't think there's been any questions, or definitely stop me if anything comes up.
No, we've seen nothing at the moment. Just one of our members had mentioned that it is a proposed code change to implement NFPA 25. Other than that, no questions or chat at the moment.
Okay.
I'll throw it back at you for now.
Okay. I'll just, I'll pull that through for information or some information that kind of came up in my head, and I wanted to pass on, whether you're aware or not. I thought it was pertinent to that. And of course, as I mentioned, so the proposal for, current submission is in there. I have no feedback. Maybe some of you have more than I, especially with the OAFC, their proposal of two of those that we were involved with, myself and Joanne at CASA, was that of asking for qualifications for those doing that, particularly, especially with the annual requirements in the province, to have qualifications similar to that, to recognition of those doing fire alarms. We wanted that language to parity what Ontario regulations already require through previously OCOT, now STO. So that, and along with their request to have exclusive application of NFPA 25 as well in there. So no feedback as far as date or hypothetical or when that's going to change or harmonization, because just like the NFC, Ontario is behind on their proposed or expected 5-year cycle as well. What also comes up, and I'll give an example. Let me see if I grab it here. So again, I'll kind of share with you if I can make it smaller.
So Steve, when you're ready there, or after your quick note here, there is one question in the chat, and I'll bring that up for you.
Oh, go ahead now. That's fine, Vince.
The question is, if the building owners have decided to use NFPA 25 as their means of ITM, would anything that is required every 3 to 5 years be enforceable?
If they adopted, yeah, unfortunately, from what I'm told, and again, not an expert on the enforcement of the Ontario Fire Code, it would be only applicable to those items that are specific to the Ontario Fire Code. So if you're enforcing that document, however, it can extend beyond, especially if you're looking at insurance and so forth, if it's deemed appropriate. So it may be enforceable on that end. So especially you don't have as many as say 15 years ago, Factory Mutual involved or ICI back in the day. They have their own documents, or sometimes it's the language is it must be done to NFPA 25 as well. So I don't think it's, and again, not being the expert on enforcement OFC, I don't think it's an all or nothing, because the language from what I read is when it does say NFPA 25, it's only applicable to those items or sections that are cited in the OFC, from my understanding.
And I believe that does answer the question.
Okay. So I just pulled up on the screen. Hopefully you can see that as well. So part of this communication, again, I love being able to speak to this group. And I know going forward, especially if it is adopted, there's a lot to cover. But I think the piece, and I'm just sharing kind of what I'm working on as well. This is almost in parity. You look at ESA or the electricians, they've been on a very much a PA for using qualified people and what you're dabbling in, and we're going to do the same for across Canada. And it's just building owners, property, that is the gap here that collectively industry, enforcement, and so forth, we have to get the information out to those that don't know and need to know. Is the responsibilities of ITM. Getting to that point, this is document, and I'll gladly share. This is almost done, just a few edits. I'll share it with your association as well. This is a national communication. The importance of ITM, who's responsible for it, is that being the owners, the property managers, and kind of some qualifications across the country and how it applies to each one as well. So I think hopefully that's something that we can address and keep on everybody's agenda and radar going forward for that as well. Future communication, and again, I don't. Once you get into 25, like I said, it's a large document. There is opportunities and means to get in there as far as whether it be requests or recommendations or application. That can come from a province. That can come from a whole country through associations and so forth. So I think that communication is important. We do on a regular basis with NFPA. They have their conference comes up in June of every year. So anything that changes potentially in a code, and again, we can have a whole lesson on how that works. Public inputs, public comments, notice of intent to make a motion, and then the voting procedures on if something is important. I know with fire services, it's probably the same here in Ontario. California was a big one. The keys, any kind of lockable items, whether everything from panels to having access to that, the language is not clear or doesn't have the owner making that available to HJs and so forth. So a lot of that information, it's good to, one, provide support or seek support. So I think it's good to have some sort of communication of what's going on and those potential changes. Whether it's awareness or agreement or disagreeing, that's probably good to especially in Canada. It's going to become important because NFPA 25, short of Ontario, once we have adoption of that, it's important to be able to, or to know how you can influence and be involved with that as well. NFPA document access. I know some of you may have copies of NFPA 25 or 13. You have those books. I was used to having physical books. I have changed. Change is good. Change is possible. I bucked the system for many years. They have NFPA document access, just like building and fire codes. You can go on NFPA. You can view everything for free. You can pay. We do pay for all sprinkler fitters and apprentices affiliated with the national JTAC. We pay for their subscription so they can download PDFs, so they can have access to the most and search through some of those documents themselves. What is changing, and again, I'll bring up just quick. Some may be aware, some maybe not. I like to put it on. At least for your information, they have what's called Nfpa Link. This is a future of code access. This has already started with CSA standards. It is happening with NFPA. NFPA is getting rid of PDFs. So if you have the code subscription, you'll find it when you try to get NFPA 13 2022, it's not available in PDF anymore. So they have, this is actually a good means. This is a dashboard of the codes that I use on a regular basis. So you can access and get into those codes themselves. You can have an offline mode as well. You get in, it looks a little bit different, but it is pretty friendly to navigate and to get through as far as what you're looking for in your chapters. You can get in there. It has enhanced functions. So if instead of getting the handbooks that some of you may be used to, it'll actually put that enhanced content in here. You can turn that on and off. So if you don't want to see that information, you just want to see the straight codes, you can do so. Whether you're doing reports and so forth, you can get in there. NFPA didn't want you to plagiarize the whole document and share it, but they do allow you to get in there and bookmark it. It keeps bookmarks from edition to edition. And then you can actually share it. You can email specific items. You can quote it and you can send it. So in your case, as an AHJ, you can send it to the owner. This is where you're citing it. If you are in fact using NFPA 25, you can grab those items and say, here, this is what we're referring to. So it is a very usable thing. It is different. There is free trials for a month. You can get group access. So if certain jurisdictions, if you got a staff of 10, you can buy a subscription price for 10. And I just want to recommend, if you are doing that, negotiate. Everything's negotiable. So if you reach out to NFPA, short of the single subscription, if you're looking for a bulk subscription, push their button a little bit. Say, I'm looking to get, we're looking to get 30, 40, 50, a few hundred, and you negotiate a price to have that subscription as well. But I just want to make aware that that's the direction it is coming. It's going to be, you're seeing in the next few years. You can still buy the books, but again, if you're on a 3-year cycle, that becomes a little difficult to maintain as well. But that kind of concludes as far as what I covered. Hopefully I touched on some things or perked your ears to look at what will change if 25 is adoptable. And again, 25 being a robust, we can look at and separate things such as impairments and specific to certain systems, because a lot of stuff does point towards those. And one last thing to bring up, there's a new document or new code coming out, NFPA 915. I actually sit on that committee, and that is the standard for remote testing and inspecting. The title is they're changing it to inspect and test, so you'll be able to do inspections and testing at a remote. So whether that's logistically, if you're covering a large area and you can't get out for commissioning, they can document things digitally. It is coming for our systems. It's not too far away. They have things that can, they can monitor pressures and plug it in. It's like plugging in your HVAC system and relying on what the performance is. You can now monitor pressures and temperatures and fire pumps automated you can run certain factors of it. It doesn't eliminate the need necessarily for qualified people to be there, or at least to witness. But some of the weekly or the monthlies can be picked up on. Even hydrant. I was looking up one day for hydrants, and somebody tipped me off. There's a thing called iHydrant. and they actually put a brain into a hydrant. They take the top off the hydrant, they put a module in there, and a probe will monitor pressures and temperatures. So the hopes is if leaks are detected, they're in front of the potential of a main blowout. So it'll allow you to stay in front of any kind of. It's a good thing and a bad thing because it takes personnel away, but at the same time, it plugs you in to monitor a system that may not be getting looked at as frequently. But that technology is it's here, and it's just a matter. You're going to see it pop up more and more in the years to come for sure. But I'll leave you with that. Any questions for sure, and that's my contact information if anybody wants to reach out or any other questions or anything pertaining to that. I'm glad to answer. Jump on a call with you at any point.
We just have one other question, Steve, in the chat there. It's basically if you can provide an update on the transition for the skilled trades in Ontario for the enforcement for referrals for HJs and owners for non-qualified people. Don't know if you can speak to that or if you have any info.
Yeah, actually, I'm waiting on a return phone call. So my understanding for STO, they now have some form of governance in there. They do have a board of governors. They do have that structure is starting. And again, with government for that to build and how it's going to be, it's a little bit different than what OCOT is. Whether you like OCOT or not, we can debate that for many hours. But the structure for access, because it is under the Crown, it is a government agency now. They will be looking at the enforcement, how it's going to roll out. They do have, I know, and Joanne's on the call as well. I know she reaches out on a regular basis. There are hotlines on STO that if there's questions about that regulation and the qualifications, you can contact them. They do have enforcement that's out there that can respond. But as far as updates to that, they haven't got far down enough to get to industry or that influence from industry, that communication. So it's you would hope for the fall, but we all know there's an election right now, so I'm not holding my breath. But there is enforcement. There is reachable. You can reach out to them for specific application questions or questions of who should be doing what. They will respond to that.
Okay, and just a little bit of chat in our chat room there regarding NFPA 25 being referenced as a whole. So it's all of it or none of it currently when referencing the Ontario Fire Code. So it's just chats about if you apply NFPA 25, do you have to use the entire thing at this point in time, or can you pick and choose, basically? I believe that's the way I understand the chat going. Your thoughts?
Yeah, that again, I can go by what I've been, or conversations in the past. Again, your enforcement, your capabilities, what you can enforce, would be nice if you can enforce to the maximum or what they're applying. If they claim to use 25, it would be nice to hold their feet to the fire that you must use 25 to the entirety. But short of getting the lawyers involved, the language from what I've read and what I've been told of people who've tried to do it is the hands are tied to enforce the Ontario Fire Code of those items in there. And in the wording that I've seen for it, or the existence reference to 25, we can say, I'm sure we can all agree that 25 is referenced in the OFC, but it always kind of, the disclaimer being, or what I read in there, which would need an explanation, is it's enforceable or it's applicable to that pertinent section. So if it's asking to do A, B, and C, you can use 25 to differ from A, B, and C, but it only applies to A, B, and C. So if there's success in a jurisdiction or otherwise, or that's the change. And again, me being the outsider to the enforcement piece of, and we don't truly have the solicitor or anybody else to put their 2 cents in. That is my understanding, or that's what I read in the language part. So that hopefully it doesn't get so far to the lawyers, but that's my understanding.
Yeah, and hopefully with the proposed code changes that we've all sat together with the Ontario Association of Fire Chiefs, the OMFPOA Fire Prevention Public Education Committee, and yourselves, we have supported those changes for the adoption of NFPA 25. So we'll see where that goes in the future. But we're stuck with the OFC right now and enforcing what's in there. So I'm going to pass it over to Gary now, Steve.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. I just wanted to talk mention quickly about the uh, chat that was going on. And I agree. Yeah, if, you can only use 25 based on what's in the fire code. Where it could start to get a bit gray, though, is if a fire safety plan is submitted for, the fire department's approval, and in the plan they just say they're going to meet NFPA 25. I think then there could be a good argument. Now you have to follow the entire document.
I would not disagree. That's what I said. Holding somebody's feet to the fire to say that they're setting the bar, and whether that's an expectation or a relative due diligence, that especially the fire service, that's what you're expecting that building to be. Whether that creates leniency on the OFC because of that, because they're upholding the value of 25, so you're expecting a higher bar or benchmark. Again, that's a lawyer's dream to weed through, and hopefully it doesn't come down to, hey, stuff went downhill and this is what happened. You said you were going to do this, but you didn't. But I think, and again, and you hit on the life safety part of it. If there's a life safety in that, you can thread that needle and lean on your F orders or however you're going to, if you can show that life safety is there. And again, and I know with Leslie speaking, when you get into nuclear, sometimes it's a completely different ballgame. So the expectation is, it may be site specific. It may be you get down to industrial that, is beyond the scope of OFC in some capacity when it comes to life safety. So if you can show that risk of harm, then you may have something there. But again, I'm not, please do not take that as me putting my neck on the line saying that Steve said, but again, that you do have some, you be the expert in that particular realm and how to apply. But yeah, it's a tough one to get the commitment. And again, it's having that all or nothing in some cases and not in others, that sort of precedence. A lawyer will find that all day long.
Yeah, but the other argument in this too, though, is, and this is just my own opinion. It's not the OMFPOA's, but I probably would ask for everything and then let the lawyers decide, or let the lawyers battle it out, because there is always a concern. Even with NFPA 13, when you start picking just parts of a standard and you don't use the entire standard, what's missing, what's going to happen, in the event of a fire.
Oh, absolutely, 100%. And we can simplify that to saying extinguishers, and everything shows that you need a certain amount of extinguishers in these particular areas. And if they go above and beyond and put, I put additional extinguishers, and then extinguisher didn't work, and then they tell you that, well, I didn't really have to have that extinguisher, so I don't really need it to work. Yeah, no, that doesn't make any sense, because if you're providing life safety or you're not, there's some due diligence or effect once you go on record. And then, like you said, the fire safety plan, I'd say that's an enforceable document right there. They, just because, they went above the bare minimum, they've kind of put the onus on them that they will provide that. So unless they counter and say, you know what, we're not going to provide that anymore and go in writing, they could have some, that would be an interesting one, Gary.
There's one other question in the question and answer here for Steve. Steve, when do you expect to have a final copy for distribution for the owner's awareness for ITMs and for qualified contractors ready?
That national document, that I can share that probably within the next few weeks. I'll float it around for editorial or what is on there, but I'll gladly share it with your association, and probably at some point, whether you want to adopt, and again, you feel free to use, plagiarize, pull out what you need. If you want to create something through the OMFPOA, through the province of Ontario, that's probably a good thing, because I think that owner, that correspondence of the owner to the owners, that's an important fact that I think over the years, and I've been involved with the request for compulsory or qualification, all this stuff you request. It's easy to talk to OFCC and the OMFPOA. Those are almost easy sells, because you know what the obvious is, but it's still the owners that are in the dark, because they're used to dealing with foremost, contractors, reputable or not. That's who communicates to them. So we really have to make sure the same message is across the board for everything. But yeah, I will share. So, sorry, yeah, long and short. Yeah, give me a few weeks, so I would anticipate sometime in the end of April for sure, and I'll share it through either yourself, Gary, or through
Yeah. If you send it to me, we'll get it to the membership. Definitely.
Awesome.